professor. I was initially trained in a subdiscipline called argumentation, which is how do we actually really kind of dig into making distinctions between a strong argument and a weak argument, and understanding and how do we talk to each other, how do we make better decisions together. My research has always been focused, going back to my grad school days, on this tension between democracy and expertise. And for me, that has to be an active tension. There's a danger if either side dominates too much. So what's the role of experts in society? What's the role of science in democracy? And how do we, come together? You'll hear a lot today about kind of dealing with value differences, but I also, care about facts and care about science and how do we kind of weave those together. My early work was focused on national politics, and I got more and more frustrated because it didn't seem like a system that was designed to solve problems or bring people together across perspectives to address shared problems. So I shifted when I got to CSU from national to local, and I shifted from being a critic. I was mainly trained to write papers about how other people are talking to becoming much more of a practitioner. And it was really this heart of, I had this idea of how people need to talk to address their difficult, complex shared problems, and I wasn't seeing it very often. So then the CBD became this kind of ongoing experiment for 20 years of, hey, if you have an organization that's designed to help people have better conversations, how might that change? So that's the work that CBD does. I don't know if y'all are familiar with it. I train primarily undergraduate students as facilitators. And then we run meetings in the community, and we're actually now fee for service. So we'll get hired by the city, by the county, by the school district, written into grants to design and facilitate meetings to help people come together and have kind of complex issues, right? So you haven't got a chance, and I don't know if you shared those links on the chat again, but I use Poll EV just kind of get a sense of things. So we'll use it a couple times here. We'll also use it. I'll set it up for a Q&A function that you can just ask questions. We'll do live Q&A at the end. I'll try to hopefully leave at least kind of 10 to 15, 20 minutes for some kind of Q&A. But I'll also just kind of capture additional questions and I can try to answer them after the fact, right? The other link on the page that I'll share with y'all again to make sure that Karen has it on the page. I just created a Google Doc resource page that has all my slides, also has a whole bunch of links behind my slides, other things I've written, other things other people have written, books and so forth. So I like to see myself as if when you hear the next 30 minutes interesting to you, I want to make it really easy for you to dive in more, right? Because I truly believe more people need to know about this stuff for us to take on our issues. So keep on hearing. So if you're curious, I've been asking this question probably about at least 10 years now. Haven't changed it. Which three of these words or phrases would kind of describe the quality of public discourse? And as almost always, normally polarization has been winning lately. We have dominated by a few loud voices won today, polarized second, mean-spirited third. Those are almost always the top three. We did have one person pick a positive one. One of y'all picked high quality informed as one of your three. I have been in rooms of over 200 and not a single positive term has got picked, right? I like to ask this at the beginning of my talks. It's a little nerve-wracking because if you don't answer the way I anticipate, I have to change my whole presentation on the fly. But sadly, I have never not got what I expected, which is all the bad terms get picked and none of the positive terms get picked. So this captures what I try to do, which is changing this, right? Part of the argument is the problems we face, particularly water, but today is going to be more broad, and then you'll apply it to water on the project, and in the video I'll kind of talk about those kind of links. Obviously, the rest of the class is about water conflict. This is a broader way of thinking differently about conflict and engagement that you'll be able to apply to water as you kind of go, right? So as I talk about the work I do now, today will be about big picture, what's happening in our democracy, but also my work is local on specific issues, right? But it will kind of cut across both of those. Also help you with significant others and children and so forth in some ways. Right now, this is kind of new stuff. Why does it keep on telling me to go away and it keeps on coming back? Say to hide floating. All right. So stay away floating. So I talk a lot about these three challenges that is making it really hard for us to come together across differences to address our shared problems. One is toxic polarization. I used to say, I think toxic polarization is our number one issue. I still kind of say that, right? And I'll get into that a little bit. I have a whole other presentation just on polarization. But I believe that when we're polarized to the level we are right now, it's really hard for us to do anything, right? Facts don't work, right? We make bad assumptions. A lot of what I'll get into is we bring out the worst of human nature and rarely tap into the best of human nature, and it kind of undermines everything, right? The good news is we're not nearly as polarized as we think. A lot of that toxic polarization is manufactured and kind of fake. The bad news is the perception of polarization is more important than the reality. And if we think the other side's evil, then we get all the bad stuff, even though most of it's not real. But it's easier to kind of undo. Then what I call information disorder, different ways, but the short version is our ability to create and share information has just exponentially exploded. Our ability to make sense of that information, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to separate weak arguments from strong arguments, has not only not kept up, it's actually backtracked quite a bit since we've lost faith in most of the institutions that did that work for us. So we're just overwhelmed with information at the same time we're overwhelmed with polarization. And then the last, a new term that people are playing with called conflict profiteers, which are people that are taking advantage of this, right? People that benefit from all the polarization and that's a reality. So we're dealing with all three of those. Those are interconnected. There's a lot of really interesting efforts addressing each of these. My argument is if you just focus on one of these without the other two, you're not going to get very far. Right? So a lot of my work is how do we take on all three of these at the same time by building capacity. So you'll kind of see how deliberation, I think, is well situated to try to kind of take on this challenge of all three at the same time. But the overall kind of part of my work is I do a lot of work in social psychology and brain science. I'm gonna have to be quick on that today, just with 40 minutes. But you'll have access to a video. If my little 10-minute review is really interesting, you can kind of dig into the weeds a lot more. But a lot of the easiest way for me to describe what I do now is how do we design processes that avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into the best. And the sad reality is 98% of our public processes do the opposite, bring out the worst in us, and don't tap into some really good stuff. So today's presentation, first half is a little kind of depressing, but it hopefully lands positively, right? And this is, I was just talking to my students about it in class 30 minutes ago. We know what to do and we know what works and we know what's dividing us and bringing us down. We just have to actually do it. We have to build the capacity to actually do these things. So this is just some of the events that we've done in the CPD. You'll see over here somewhere water growth issues. We did a big project on water. I'll show you a couple of things. What, 15 years ago now, or even one of our early kind of processes. So we're process experts, not content experts. Right? So we apply a process of how to engage issues across things. I've also been involved with water literate leaders. I give a talk similar to this at the first month of water literate leaders since it existed, 10 years ago or so. So I've done lots of water. So what I'm gonna try to do is cover three big arguments. One is this basic writ, and it popped up again, but hopefully I don't have too much interesting stuff on the top. And yes, I talk fast normally. I'm Argentinian. If you like watching podcasts listening to podcasts at 1.5, I'll be good. I apologize if you don't like fast talkers. But I'm excited. I got lots of stuff I want to share with you. The slide deck's too big. I'll skip some stuff, but I was like, you have access to it. If you want to dig into the details, you will afterward. So three big arguments. The first is, how many of y'all wicked problems is a term? I don't know if y'all have used that much in here yet. No. How many of wicked problems something here? Okay, so a few of you, right? So I'll talk a little bit about how I think about wicked problems and how I see it as a very useful framework to help us have better conversations, right? So I'll dig into that and I'll spend some time there because water is clearly a wicked problem, particularly in the West, right? And then the second part will be digging into bad news of why are we so polarized? What are these negative aspects of human nature? I'm gonna go really quick through that stuff and just kind of give you some highlights to hopefully set up the hopeful news. Once we see the world through the lens of this wicked problems lens, and we understand how our brains work and how most of our processes don't, we can start making changes. How do we change our conversations so we have the conversations, the engagement, the collaborative problem solving processes that we need, right? And I'll talk a little bit about your assignment. I've kind of mentioned it today, but then you'll get a follow-up video and kind of submit more information and access. So whole literature on wicked problems. It's as old as me. The first article was printed about it when the day I was born, or not the day, the year I was born. Started from civil engineers that kind of saw that the way they kind of explained it is the kind of problems they were trained to solve in the classroom and the kind of problems they're asked to solve when they started working for cities and municipalities were very different. So they made this distinction between a tame problem and a wicked problem. Tame problem could be really, really complex, but there was a scientific kind of technical answer to it. right? So experts solve tame problems. But what they were saying is like, these problems they're asking me to solve are they're value laden, right? They involve multiple underlying values that don't fit together, and then different people in the community prioritize those values differently, and it gets really messy really quick, and it requires a different skill set. So that's the heart of the work I do. So that's how I define wicked problems. It is kind of a systemic view of it, but the best way to do it is to think of some example. And I create these wicked problem slides quite a bit that I'm digging into an issue from this impartial perspective. Start having conversations with people, start digging into the noise. The city will send all the emails they got on an issue, and I'll go to, at the newspaper in Colorado, had an article on it. I'll look at the message board, which is so painful. But you get some insights on how people are talking about it. Right? Go to different websites and try to find what are all the underlying values. What are the things people care about that are relevant to this issue, and identify those values and kind of put them on the table. So there's one project we did about 6 years ago with Platte River Power Authority. It should say power generation, as looking at power generation as a wicked problem. This one was interesting because the first time I met with Platte River to do these meetings, their mission statement, I know you probably can't read it, Platte River will safely provide reliable, environmentally responsible, and financially sustainable energy. Right? Their mission statement is a wicked problem statement to me. Right? They want these 4 things. Well, I can tell you from doing this work, those 4 things don't fit together very well. There's natural maybe not a zero sum, but focusing on one makes it harder to focus on the other. As we'll get into, our brains don't like that. Our brains want to focus on one value at a time. Our brains want simple stories. Our brains want, I care about a value. Therefore, if you disagree with me, we love defining the other side as being against something, right? Because that makes us feel pretty good. And I don't have to bother really talking to you or listening to you because I know, well, they just have bad values, right? But the easy way to think about this is our brains want to assume problems are caused by wicked people rather than putting the wickedness in the problem, right? So we're kind of shifting it. Like, what happens if we, even if it's an intellectual exercise, what happens if we put the wickedness in the problem? Does that spark a different conversation? So I'm coming in with a new issue, looking at it. What are all the things that people care about? Identify those, put them on the table, and recognize the kind of natural tensions. So I try to spark, the basic conversation is often one value at a time. Particularly when you think about one time in a microphone on a controversial issue in front of the city council, it's literally one person with a microphone, and often based on one value. This is most important. And we never talk about the tensions between values or never try to kind of get creative about them. So I try to spark 3 conversations that don't happen very naturally. Long term is this balancing. How do we find the better balance? How do we negotiate the natural tensions between them? And it's not a balance of an equal amount of each. It's a unique balance depending on what's important to us and how people rank. And but how do we have that tough conversation to find better balances? The recalibrating conversation is more, someone can have a really strong opinion about one value dominating too much, or one value being left behind, or a new value we need to consider, right? So I'm okay with strong activist voices, but I don't, whenever an issue is framed as only one issue or one value is relevant, I know it's going to be a bad conversation because it automatically defines the people that disagree with them by what they're against. And that doesn't work very well, right? So make the argument to elevate your value, just don't do your value by itself, right? And then the last one, which can be the best conversation, not always possible, is once we identify those values and put them on the table and recognize tensions, we set off a lot of human creativity and innovation to think about what are better ways of transcending that tension. Can we create a win-win? Can we do both, right? Because once I define, instead of defining you about what you're against, once I know what you want, and I want that too, I just want my stuff more, right? Now we can, hey, how can we work together to get both of these? And that taps in like Fisher and Urey getting the yes, it's like the most famous conflict resolution book of switching to kind of interest-based, right? Of moving from positions, what people want, to interest, what they want, right? And how do we get real and creative? So jumping ahead a little bit, the most important positive aspect of human nature to tap into is creativity. Most our politics doesn't do that. Because if we have a very simple story and we can just blame the other side, we don't have to get creative. All we have to do is vanquish the enemy, right? So switching from problems caused by wicked people to wicked problems taps into that creativity. And that's a great example of this, because when we did this 7 years ago, the problem is if we switch to solar and wind, we need a whole bunch of batteries. And batteries were really, really expensive, right? If we don't have batteries, then, well, wind and solar is not reliable because it's not always, the wind's not always blowing and the sun's not always shining, right? Well, 6 years ago, we realized that's the tension. We need a lot better batteries. And we've spent 7 years of unleashing all the engineers to get much better batteries, Now, batteries have their own environmental impacts that are hidden, so it's still kind of wicked, right? But this tension is much less of a tension now, right? As we're kind of moving forward in some interesting ways. So this is the water slide that we created. This one's a little bit different. Instead of like values, it's more interests, like what people care about. But I created this in the project about 15 years ago. We had 300 people show up to an initial event. I had little half sheets of paper asking people what's important to them. Again, I'm the argumentation person. I want to see the reasons they give for something. Values are often kind of unstated, they're implied in that, right? So that's part of the art that I teach my students. How do you bring out the hidden underlying values and help people kind of bring those values to kind of the surface or the interest? So these are 9 things that people care about with water for when we did it back then. Same concept is each of these 9 things, none of them are bad. Right? Reasonable people can care about these things. That's why I put economic vitality versus like greed, right? We purposely frame these as positive. But the reality is as we try to deal with water in the West, there's lots of natural tensions coming. And the conversations we need to have, we tend to have the conversations one box at a time. We need to talk about the tensions between these things and how do we negotiate that. Which is again something our brains are not wired for, and the loudest voices don't tend to rely on that. Right? I'm just going to show you a few other ones. Then when you click it, undoes my clicker. There we go. Here are some other ones, just really quick. So healthcare in some ways really complex, but really these 3 values, they don't fit together. Food, we did this out at Steamboat Springs in a process. So that was a little bit more complicated, but same idea. Individually, these are all good things. They don't fit together very well, right? So how do we kind of engage the tensions and think of better ways of doing that? We did a project for parking on campus. I was thinking it was a pretty technical kind of tame problem, right? And we did this open-ended survey and all these values, all these passions, it got pretty emotional pretty quickly. Sustainability can be framed, especially triple bottom line, as this notion. This is kind of the best example of the transcendent, right? A well-paying, clean energy job is good for people, it's good for the economy, it's good for the environment, right? There's this whole story about the environmental movement in the late 70s, early 80s of shifting, instead of this adversarial us versus them, right? If we frame it as a triple bottom line and we say, hey, profit's good, we're not going to demonize you for wanting profit, but how do we talk about all 3 of these? Still a minority part of the environmental movement, but it was a big shift. And that's really kind of an example of what I want to do. When we shift from an adversarial us versus them process to a collaborative work in the same problem, we have much better conversations. So how do we kind of negotiate that shift and build capacity for it? This is something I did out at Estes. I don't know if any of y'all are from Estes. The interesting kind of communities got lots of natural tensions to it. A lot of people retire to Estes and don't want any tourists, right? But the whole economy is based on tourism, right? So you have some nice kind of conflicts there. This one I'm going to show just briefly. This is obviously a huge can of worms. But just to show you on this one, when you think about COVID, sometimes you have to prioritize the value, right? So early days of COVID, when we're trying to figure out, how do we react to COVID, we could prioritize and center public health, larger font, but then also recognize that other things, reasonable people can care about other things, right? And if we just frame anyone pushing back on mandates or whatever as, oh, they just hate science or they just hate grandma, right? That's not very productive, right? And that kind of makes the conversation worse. So last one I'll do, kind of preamble of the Constitution. Embedded in there are some big values. We translate those into kind of more modern kind of terms: justice, security, equality, freedom for us, and freedom for future generations. These are these basic, in the rhetorical studies literature, they're called God terms, these powerful words that kind of premises for persuasion that dominate so much, right? We talk about these all the time, normally one at a time. But the reality is these 5, plus a lot of other ones, naturally underlie so many different issues, right? And there's so many kind of basic tensions between them. Right? I don't have as normally I kind of do a whole exercise here, take 15 minutes to have you kind of rank these and prioritize them. So I have that there. That takes a little bit too much time. But whenever I've done that, you see everyone ranks these differently, right? Different people define these differently. And just with those 5, there's some pretty big tensions and they don't fit together very well. We don't talk about them, right? So that's where my work is, like retraining your brain to rewire. Your brain doesn't want tensions, it wants simple. Instead, like lean into the tension, look for the tension. You're starting to talk about people from different perspectives, right? Figure out, okay, this is the heart of the issue that we're not talking about. And how do we change that conversation? So these are just some other kind of natural tensions. Whole another presentation. I'll give you a link in the resource page. Has anyone ever heard polarity management as a concept? Kind of curious in the room. Coming from business management world, but it's kind of a whole field of like, how do we dig into the tensions? How do we dig into the paradoxes? Deborah Stone's policy paradox, kind of a classic in political science that does the same thing, right? That we often, if I'm an advocate, if I'm an activist, I'm framing things around one value, right? Whereas if I'm a facilitator, if I'm trying to bring people together across perspective, I'm bringing in the tensions because that's with all these issues that we deal with. That's the heart of what we have to talk about that we don't talk about naturally. So to end the wicked problems part, for me, the literature wicked problems is more of a category or type of problems. Some of y'all might be familiar with hyphens, type 1, 2, and 3 kind of problems from adaptive leadership from Harvard. It's type 3 problems are very similar to wicked. I use it more like a lens through which to see problems, right? So it's not that some problems are wicked or not. It's more of a tool in your toolkit. You can step back and like, if we look at this as a wicked problem, how might that change the conversation? And how might that open up space for different kinds of conversations, right? While dealing with wicked problems well requires it to have some really tough conversations across perspectives. We need to tap into creativity. We need collaborative action to work on things together. If you go back to the question I asked you at the beginning, what words we use to describe how we engage each other, we're pretty far from that, right? So that's the work that we have to do is like, how do we build capacity for me, particularly in our local communities, to have these kind of conversations, to change how we talk about these issues. So now on that same kind of pull EV, again, got the QR codes on the side if you moved away from it. It's just going to open up to just a Q&A thing, right? And that I'll collect these, that way I can kind of answer afterwards. We'll spend some time again, hopefully, live, but if you're online, you can kind of engage that as well. So now I want to get to the bad news. And I'm going to go fast here because I want to get to what we actually do and have time for Q&A. But starting, heck, now it's probably about 12 years ago, I helped with the stadium process. The stadium process to build a new stadium was highly polarizing, right? It was polarizing before I got involved, and then I got an email from Tony Frank going, "Hey, you think you can help us with that?" And I was like, "Don't say no to a president." It was a very interesting process, but I realized after the fact, people made their decision before it started, right? People kind of had their answer, and it was just really hard to get them to move, right? I can tell you lots of stories about that. You do learn the most lessons from the most difficult projects, right? So I learned a lot from that project, but it also sent me to the library because I was like, why were people so polarized? Why were people like, their minds were made up with very little information whatsoever. So I did a deep dive for 3 or 4 years, really digging into social psychology and brain science literature. I'll give you a link to a video of me talking a little bit more in depth about this. I also have a short article in National Civic Review that reviews it. And then I have like a 70-page deep dive with all the citations if you want that, right? Getting a little dated now, but I've kept up with it and nothing, not huge changes to it, right? I'm updating it all now for my book. These are some of the books that I read for it, just like some of these titles. This one won a Nobel Prize. I imagine some of y'all are familiar with this one. Kahneman makes the argument that we're cognitive misers, right? We don't want to think if we don't have to. So most of us think fast. We use heuristic, use basic rules to get through the world. But we have the ability to think slow. We can stop, slow down, and tap into different things. So a lot of my process is how do we, at least temporarily, switch people from fast thinking to slow thinking, right? To have a higher order kind of critical thinking, group thinking that we need. Then you'll see the negativity here. You're not smart. 46 other ways you're deluding yourself. How your brain distorts and deceives. What makes your brain happy when you should do the opposite. Jonathan Haidt really kind of talks about the moral foundations between progressives and conservatives. This is a classic in the field of why do people hold on to misinformation, even though all the research shows that they're wrong. When I mentioned that in front of an audience of city managers, they're all like, because they know how often that kind of happens. This one's in particular, this is a newer one. This is after my research, but really digs into my side bias, which is connected to confirmation bias. Y'all familiar with, we're biased towards our side and really soft on our side and hard on their side, right? The rules of evidence depend on if we agree with it or not. We're really support our priors. The key thing I want to say here, particularly to a room, primarily graduate students, right? For most cognitive biases, the smarter you are and the more educated you are, the more you'll come to control the bias, the less impact it will have on you, except for my side bias. My side bias The smarter you are, the more educated you are, the better you are at finding evidence you're right and refuting evidence that tries to challenge you. So the stuff I'm talking about here for the next few minutes is not, oh, uneducated people are so easy to manipulate, right? Some of the most educated people that believe they're truly informed made a decision 20 years ago, and for 20 years has been, collecting just one side of the issue because they put the blinders on. So this is tough stuff, right? So I'm gonna skip fast because I'm just gonna give you, these are the big kind of key themes of this. And most of y'all probably, the world has been so like motivated reasoning on steroids for the last 12 years, but our brains are wired for certainty and consistency. This is the my side bias, right? Once we make a decision, we seek out to defend it. We love a simple narrative, particularly a good versus evil narrative. We love our heroes and our victims and our villains. And once we decide who's playing what character, we see their actions through that, and we basically get what we want to get. We're groupish. I like this term from Jonathan Haidt. Most of I probably have 15 books on my shelf that use tribal, right? Our tribal tendencies. Humans are designed psychologically, socially to be in groups, right? We love our teams. I like the word groupish because it also mentions that we're actually not selfish. As a species, we're actually one of the most cooperative species in lots of interesting ways, right? But we also, of all the species, there's one book called Making Monsters, we're one of the only species that demonizes our own kind in some way, right? We're very much in tune to us versus them kind of frameworks. And obviously some of the worst things humans have ever done is define to them and dehumanize them and justify atrocities to them, right? It's two sides of the same coin. Really, really bad stuff come from this, and really good stuff can come from it. My shift from national politics to local, I get away from the red team and the blue team to, oh, maybe it's the Northern Colorado team, and you have some basic kind of connections that you're starting with in something, right? So a lot of my work is how do we kind of tap identities in positive ways versus ways that divide us, right? Another way to think about this is our brains are wired to be like catty corner thinkers, right? We're really good at all the reasons why we're right and they're wrong, right? And of course, you do the opposite, right? So I'm thinking, why does he prefer this to this, right? And you're thinking, why does he prefer this to this? And you can tell when we both think we're idiots, right? You're like, how can they think that way? So we're naturally blind to the downside of our perspective, the upside of the opposing perspective, because we almost want to win 100%, right? And giving respect to the other side and saying, well, I reckon, this is a good point that you have, right? Seems like a sign of weakness. You're not playing the game right. So how do we kind of change it? So we have this basic human nature that's wired like this. And then our national political system, our national media system, our tech platforms are all designed to take advantage of that and make it worse. Just a couple more minutes of the bad news, and we'll get to the good news. Right? So then when you look at these, the fourth one is we filter and cherry pick evidence to support our views. This is the heart of my research of how do we process arguments. So in the longer thing, I go through these 5 stages of motivated reasoning, right? We're motivated. I like to think that we're motivated for accuracy or truth, but our brains are wired, motivated to protect our team, right? To protect the decisions we've already made. So these are all kind of stages. You see a lot of these terms that you've kind of learned over the years, but it leads to this point that we have pretty strong blinders on that then people can take advantage of. And that leads to, we're really bad at dealing with dilemmas and values tensions and paradoxes. So I did it quick this time, 32 minutes. I really made 2 points. One is the best way to look at a complex issue is to lean into the tensions, to seek out the paradoxes. And the second point was our brains are not wired to do that. We don't like to do that naturally, right? So we have to figure out better ways of doing that. The second part of the bad news, that was all individual, how we get our blinders on. Then you have how it gets worse. So you start with the biases, negative interaction effects as you try to have a conversation with someone with a different pair of blinders. It goes badly. I won't be able to talk about this, but a great little TED talk that reviews her research on how we move from the ignorance assumption to the idiot assumption, finally to the evil assumption. The Russell effect is the loudest voices are often the most polarized and they dominate the conversations. It's one of the reasons we seem a lot more polarized than we actually are. On top of that, you have the conflict profiteers that are feeding you the simple narratives because they benefited from them. Then you have the internet, which is wonderful in so many ways. It's also really good at bringing like-minded people together. It's really good at nitpicking and cherry picking and doing these kind of bad things. And then we have a political system that incentivizes all this, right? That rewards bad arguments and punishes good arguments and gives the loudest voices that are attacking the other side the incentives to do that, right? So it basically takes this basic human nature and then grows it because of negativity bias. We're attuned to bad news more than good news, right? We're easily scared and fearful, so we get a lot of the bad news. The joke I've heard a lot lately is like, what would happen if airline industry, flying tonight, advertised like politics? Like every single advertisement was like how bad the other companies are, right? Like how many crashes they've had and video of mechanics cutting corners. Like no one would fly and we would and that's why I think when you ask people on surveys, I'm pretty sure politicians are under cockroaches now, right? I mean, it's when they ask all those kind of questions. But that's because they're playing into human nature, right? And they know what works. So that leads to this vicious cycle that leads to where we are in politics, this outrage industrial complex, this mean-spiritedness. And most importantly, all of this is we've got issues we need to talk about. We've got problems. And we're spending so much energy and so much time on all of this game on top of it that we just know doesn't work, right? Process people that design processes, it's almost like national politics was designed for really bad conversations, and we're constantly kind of rewarding that. Last bit of bad news, experts aren't going to save us here. There are some political science books of like, against democracy, like we need to give up on democracy, it's not working, we should just have an epistemocracy ruled by experts. By definition, experts don't do really good with values. Experts, by definition, know a whole bunch about a little bit. Right? Wicked problems are inherently systemic and cutting across. Right, so I have a lot of respect for experts. We need experts. We need them on tap, not on top. As one of the facilitator kind of sayings, we need to figure out how to weave expertise and democracy together, which is part of what you'll be doing on your assignments. But we can't just say, let experts make the decisions for us, right? Experts are good at gathering information. They're not really good at making decisions across values. So we get to the good news. At least kind of give you some of this before we kind of go to Q&A here. So I got 5 steps that I'm working on to build community capacity. This first, adopting the wicked problems mindset, is kind of a review what I just did. So I'm actually going to skip that for now, I think. Part about what I will say, working a lot with leadership programs, the superpower of 21st century leaders is going to be the ability to bring people together across perspectives. What works, it's a very different skill set kind of shifting. A big problem with our democracy right now is we elect these people, right? Because that's who wins elections. But then once in office, we expect them to be these people. And they just don't have the skill set and the processes aren't set up for that, right? The more local you get, the more, you might actually elect facilitated leaders, right? I'm going to skip that because I want to get to, so what we need to do is change how we engage, change our processes. So again, going back to the challenge of avoid triggering the worst of human nature and tap into the best. I share the worst of human nature. Here's the best. Here's the good stuff. And researching this is so much better for my soul, right? To go into like, hey, what's good about humans and how do we tap into it versus all this horrible stuff that we keep on tapping into, right? So this is the other side of the coin, that we are social, that we're groupish, right? That we are cooperative, that you can tap into, that we care about other people. It's just how you frame and how you activate people in important ways, right? So one book that really kind of gets into that, Daniel Pink's Drive kind of as well, kind of captures these things that we all agree on a lot of stuff, right? And we can be motivated. One thing I'm really tapping into here is, if y'all have heard about the notion of flow from psychology. It's this argument that humans are actually at their happiest when they're doing hard things well. And part of what I'm trying to set up is, doing democracy in a diverse community is a really, really hard thing that you can get joy from. So how do we tap into that? We want to do hard things well and turn it into democracy. We're inherently empathetic and cooperative. Right. There's one book, Social Instinct, compares humans to other kind of species. Right. It makes this argument that we might be the only planet with the ability to feel another person's pain. We're not the only species that welcomes the stranger, but we do it in ways that are unparalleled to others, of helping each other. Right. As divisive and as polarized as we are right now, we also have this basic thing of humans wanting to help other humans if you set it up right. Right. Really, the problem, I should have said this earlier. All that negative stuff is easier to trigger. It's more basic, it's more evolved, right? So I literally kind of talk about like don't trigger that part. I want to trigger this part back here, right? So we need to figure out how do we design these processes to get our brains to work together. And literally, some of this research, we're watching people's brains as they do things and what part of the brain lights up, right? So we know as they're reading or watching a video, okay, instead of getting that fight or flight, getting that attack, how do we get that creativity, right? Which leads to humans are inherently creative. We're really, really good collaborative problem solvers when put in a situation to tap into that. But we're cognitive misers. So if we can blame the problem on the other side, right, and rally around our side saying how horrible they are, oh, much prefer that. That's a better story, right? But it doesn't tend to work, right? And while the negative stuff's easier to trigger, the more you do this, the easier it is to do. Our brains aren't determinate, right? So we can kind of create new synapses, and individuals can kind of create different habits, and organizations can develop different norms, and communities can develop different cultures, and we start changing how we talk about issues, right? A lot of this stuff, when you go back to the social psychology, I didn't really dig into it. Facts aren't going to save us. We actually have research that shows when we're polarized, the stronger your argument, the more it will backfire in some interesting ways, right? So I'm not saying facts don't matter. I'm saying when we're polarized, facts aren't going to do what you want them to do. So when I'm talking to a room full of experts, try to convince them you have a vested interest in changing the conversation. Because as the conversation gets elevated, if the facts are on your side, that's a long-term benefit, right? It's not a short-term rhetorical benefit, right? One good story kind of kills statistics every day, right? But your benefit of the facts being on your side is they continue to be on your side generally, right? They don't go away. So I try to make these 4 shifts, like I mentioned. Shift from the assumption of wicked people to wicked problems. And I will say briefly here, I'm not saying that there's not wicked people, right? And part of the conflict profiteer and bad faith, we've got to recognize that yes, there's some people that are taking advantage of it. I will say like half the country isn't evil, right? Pretty confident of that. I'm also very confident that very few people self-identify as wicked. And I know from the research, if you tell someone that they don't think they're wicked, that you think they're wicked, it's unlikely to make them less wicked. So I kind of do two kinds of projects or kind of a spectrum. Some are clear wicked problems, reasonable people on all different sides. This is really complex, and I know deliberation is the best way for us to kind of get at this. There's other problems as I'm going in, I'm like, it's pretty clear one side's got a lot of better arguments. So the facts are on their side, or the other side's manipulative, or whatever. Sometimes, okay, we need protest or power, strategic politics, but sometimes I still think the best way to get to move the needle is going to be do a deliberative process. Or think about it this way: if you believe the world really is powerful, bad people controlling, oppressing, I think they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other, facts don't matter. And if we start changing the way we talk about issues, then it's going to make it harder for them to kind of do what they're doing. So how do we change that? We switch from adversaries to collaborators. That switches from inciting the worst to the best. And also for the experts, that switches from facts, it's not really working, it's just ammunition or fake news, to, hey, when we're trying to solve problems together, we want good information. And all of a sudden that facts, that data and science and democracy kind of comes together in some interesting ways. So how do we build that capacity? I'm going to try to shut down here. So very interdisciplinary, very extradisciplinary. A lot of practitioner organizations. There's a whole world out there of people that focus on how we have better conversations. Again, we know how to do this. We just don't use any of it in our political system, right? Which is so frustrating, right? I talk a lot about the distinction between debate, deliberation, and dialogue. I'll give you a little working document if that sounds particularly interesting to you. But this is the heart of what we do in meetings, and you'll see your projects embedded in this. So one is a concept. We gave you this as an optional reading. So if you want to dig into this, I talk about my work is informed by a concept I developed called principled impartiality. So I'm impartial. I'm this third person that I have to be trusted as an impartial. I don't have a dog in the fight, but I'm also committed to democracy and I'm committed to good information, right? And I recognize there's a tension there. So if one side's got good information, the other side's just making crap up, but I want to be neutral there, right? And there's a lot of democratic value. I'm a partisan for democracy. I'm just impartial about the specific issue. And some of that is what topics I choose to pick. But instead of just a simplistic neutrality, both sidesism and false equivalency, we have a deeper kind of what's this role of neutrality, which I think like the Water Institute We're being embedded in this, right? Like, hey, we care about good information, we care about democracy, but we want to be a resource to help people have better conversations about this tough issue, right? Second, how are we framing the issue? So our processes, so you'll be framing, whatever water conflict you want to kind of dig into for your project as a wicked problem. We want multiple approaches. Very much want to get away from a yes/no framing. I can tell you right now, if the issue is framed as yes/no, you're for or against one particular solution to a problem. Everyone's already decided the yes or no, which means their brain's off. That just doesn't work very well, right? So all our processes try to step back and say, hey, let's talk about a problem. Let's consider multiple approaches to that problem, different ways of doing it, instead of one at a time, right? The other problem with one at a time is negativity bias. More no's naturally show up, right? I mean, think about it. If you see something the city's doing and you think it's a good idea, you're like, well, that sounds cool, and you go on with your day, right? If you see something you don't like, you're like, well, hell no, when you show up, right? So we know when it's a yes/no issue, you're going to highly oversample the no's. You activate, primary weight voters are activated as complainers, and that's just a bad conversation, right? So we want to activate people as collaborative problem solvers. So how do you frame the issue to tap into that creativity? So most important to what y'all are doing, you'll get a lot more of this later, is almost all our processes have some sort of discussion guide, some sort of framework that takes a while for us to develop, that makes sense of the noise and reframes it in a specific way that people are reacting to at these meetings. We often call them a placemat because you're like waiting for people at their table when they show up, right? There's an art to this. When you're designing a document, the purpose of the document is to spark high quality conversation, which is bringing together expertise and facts, but also bringing together multiple perspectives and honoring democracy and diversity and pluralism in a way, right? So it's very different than just informing people or trying to persuade people. So the video, what I was going to do next week is talking about the theory behind these discussion guides, give you some examples, and then towards the end of the semester, you'll be working on kind of developing one of these discussion guides for your issue as a way of doing things, right? So it helps, a good discussion guide helps fill in these blank spots, right? Because you're naturally showing it's coming from a wicked problems perspective, which means there's no magic bullet, there's no perfect thing, right? You don't solve a wicked problem, you find better ways of engaging it, because there's no technical, hey, we implement the solution, the problem's gone, right? So you're laying out these options and you're fairly, here's the upside, here's the values of support, here's the downside. So instead of just this, where it's a catty corner, you'll have multiple approaches. And your job will be to like, hey, here's the supporting arguments, and then here's the trade-offs or the downside of each. So people can kind of really think through those, right? So here's just some examples of this NIF, National Issues Forum approach. Again, the video will give you a lot more. This is one that Longmont did, like 4 future generations. I think future directions for the future. Here are like ways of dealing with land use conflict. This is one that CPD did about kind of how do we deal with an aging population that often lose your ability to drive. On how we do that. This is basically what you're going to be creating is a 1-page 11 by 16 tabloid that I'll give you the template for. This is one that we did for the local food. At least 3 approaches, they might be 3 or 4. Here are some specific action steps. Here are like the arguments, the key arguments for it, and here's the trade-offs. So you're kind of creating this. NIF books are like 30 pages long, and then the last 2 pages look like this. You're just creating a placemat in this class because it's just a 1-hour class, right? So kind of develop that, right? So it's going to look a little bit like this. You have 3 approaches with different actions. People like some of the actions or they might push back on some of the actions. And this looks like a wicked problem slide, right? But these are the underlying values to the issue on how they mix. That's why there's not a right answer, because it depends on how the mix of all these things. Then we try to have small groups. We have processes designed for interaction. So when we're designing processes, we're not just one time the microphone, we're not just asking for input, we're getting people to talk to each other. With a facilitator, small groups. This is the other optional reading we gave you. NCDD, kind of nice little guide that shows you a whole bunch of different ways of engaging people more productively versus just a debate versus just a one at a time on the microphone. Right? And then facilitators, my training students, facilitators, you're not having to run a process. All you're doing is creating a discussion guide based on the kind of research the class for the semester. So last 2 are longer term things, but I just want to end. That's the bad news. This is the good news. When we engage people differently, it gets easier and easier. It becomes a virtuous cycle. The more we engage each other, the more we retrain our brains, the more we kind of, the tactics that divide us and the simple stories that we're being pitched don't work as well. And we start figuring out how do we build capacity in our communities to address our shared problems more productively. So I switched that. I know there's some, if y'all put a Q&A, I can put that back in as well. I did want to kind of ask, is there one thing top of mind that kind of jumps out at you from today? I'll kind of let that kind of go in the background. But yeah, I left 12 minutes for questions. So a little bit of time here. Again, I can also come back, but then I'll also engage y'all kind of individually as y'all start getting into your projects. But take a breath. It's nice. Okay. So initial questions, we'll have some time here to kind of engage. Again, I'll give you a lot more information about your project in a subsequent video that I'll try to kind of knock out for you. Y'all buy it? Yeah.
Can you give an example of a wicked problem that's been handled well?
Yeah, so my favorite example, and actually it allows me to talk about what are their leaders as well. So you saw the rethinking transportation, right? So we started this project 18 years ago it was called the silver tsunami, which is a horrible term, which is, the baby boomers retiring, right? The percentage of our population. I think the stat that we had back then was over the next 15 years, the percentage of our population over 65 was going to increase 130%, so more than double. The population over 80 was going to quintuple. So we basically asked this question: what kind of community do we want for our aging population, right? We ran it was the senior center, the Fort Collins Senior Center, the Fort Collins Senior Advisory Board, and the CPD kind of hosting this. Well, after the first year, a lot of excitement, people want to do stuff. Transportation was kind of at the top, and then some other things. But those organizations well, we don't have time to kind of do that. I'm ready to move to action. So we switched to the county because the county had the Office on Aging is a county government versus city government, the aging programs from the federal government. And we had a philanthropic group called the Foundations on Aging, a little bit of money that they did emergency grants. Well, they came together. We actually created a new 501c3. It's called the Partnership for Age-Friendly Communities. It is this organization now. Now it's a full, have an executive director with a salary. It's inherently cross sector. So it's got city government, county government, private organizations, nonprofits. A lot of it is young retirees that still want to do stuff, that are kind of spending a lot of time. But for me, as I did more and more research, and Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and Bonding and Bridging Capital, I don't know if you've run across those terms. But for me, after the fact, I realized it's this exact organization that we need in the community. Most organizations focus on a topic, an advocacy group, are focused on a specific solution. And they're what called bonding social groups, which they bring in like-minded people together, right? So you join the NRA because you want to fight for gun rights, or you join Sierra Club or that kind of stuff, right? So that's bringing like-minded people, and it's almost like there's this problem and we already have the solution. And let's mobilize lots of people that think like us, right? Which is important in the broader kind of marketplace of ideas. The Partnership for Age-Friendly Community is different. It cares a whole bunch about a topic, but it's really open-minded about solutions. Right? It wants to be collaborative. It knows we have to cut across public, private, nonprofit lines. It knows we got to cut across conservative and progressive lines, right? It wants to be creative. So it's a convener, it's a catalyst, right? So instead of a bonding advocacy group, I think it's a bridging advocacy group, right? Water Literate Leaders is the same thing, right? I talk about these nationally, right? It's a group, they really care about water, and they say, you know what? Our region needs to get a lot better at this conversation because it's a tough conversation. Right, so have you talked about Water Literacy here, or it's the program with the CSU Water Institute and the Community Foundation of Northern Colorado? It's one of those cohort models, so 30 people join a year, and it's once a month for 9 months. And they bring in water lawyers, and they bring in hydrologists, they bring in they bring in me to give a similar talk the first day, right? And there's people from Weld County, there's people from, there's conservatives, there's progressives, there's small town, there's big town, and it's all about how do we increase our capacity in our community to have the tough conversations. And it brings in a whole bunch of expertise, but I come in with the wicked problems to say, hey, different people care about different things. But it's all about, for me, again, it's bridging advocacy group. They care a lot about an issue. They're open-minded and creative about solutions. Right. And so they're sparking much better conversations, and they're wanting to do things right. So, yeah, other questions?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, what would be some recommendations for leaning into the tensions if you don't have a third party facilitator? For example, maybe you're in a personal conversation at something, how do you do that without having sort of a
Yeah.
third person.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about, there's a lot of individual skills that you have for these individual conversations. I tend to be on the radio a lot around Thanksgiving, right? Because you're like, I like to talk to Uncle Rico at Thanksgiving dinner. So there are a lot of skill set, and that's important, right? But I always want to do it at two levels. Like, hey, we need individuals that have the better skill set. And part of it is, because I truly believe with all the negative aspects of communication are positive, the more you understand that, the less power the negative ones have, right? Like once your brain, like once you know I want a simple story, then simple stories don't work on you very much because you're like, wait a second. Right? I like to think at a CPD meeting, and I should have said this earlier, we've run about 500 meetings in 19 years. So this isn't just like theory, this is most of everything is like from actual doing real things in the community over and over and over, right? I like to think of a CPD meeting, if someone has a really simple solution to a complex problem, they kind of look silly, right? People are like, that's not what we're doing here. Whereas when you're talking on the microphone, I get rewarded, right? Because I just have a microphone, and who walks up to that microphone? People that have some theories and think across the knee, right? But back to your question, one thing I'll suggest, I think it's already on the resource page at the very bottom. Monica Guzman works for Braver Angels, has a great TED talk about the art of curiosity, which is all about how to talk to people you disagree with, right? What questions do you ask them? She has a whole book called I Never Thought of It That Way, which is pretty good as well. But that's kind of my go-to. Like, watch that, and it kind of helps you. She self-describes herself as a progressive Latina from Seattle whose parents voted for Trump. So when people are telling her how horrible Trump people are, she's like, those are my parents, right? Which happens to be my situation as well. My immigrant parents. So a lot of it is learning how to ask those questions. I'll also say that getting to yes, especially that chapter of moving from positions to interest. You're just trying to figure out how do you get beyond the assumption you have or what they believe to actually figure out, okay, what do they actually believe? And it's not because when you figure that out, you're like, oh, that's a good thing. It might be like, oh, that's why they think that way. That might pragmatically now give you what you need to change their mind, right? So part of really, really good listening, sometimes you listen, you realize, oh, okay, yeah, they've got some good stuff. And we need to, and then sometimes you're like, oh, okay, this is how they're misinformed, or this is how they're getting it wrong. So it works on multiple levels, but you have to start with truly listening, because the assumptions that we make about each other are almost always wrong. So you had one on mine, or?
More like a comment.
Right.
They said the term polarization tends to imply two equal arguments, which can simplify complex conflict.
Yeah, and I'll talk, I mean, to say something, the way I framed this before is, I think we're overly polarized, right? Sometimes people think when I'm pushing back on polarization, I want this opposite. Like, we all agree and kind of this, so this is false polarization, this is false harmony, right? I think there's a lot of protective ground in between, right? Certainly when you dig in, I have a whole nother talk just on polarization, the causes and what we should do about it. We're clearly very polarized. Who's to blame for that, and avoiding both sides of false equivalency and so forth. I think there's some complex kind of things there that we're trying to kind of work on. But I also think when we're going back to the conflict profiteers, toxic polarization, information disorder, a lot of people are just working on the toxic polarization. And just we just got to bring people together in reds and blues and so forth. And they often kind of lose the fact that no, facts should still matter, or some people are benefiting from the polarization. So that's where, if we just focus on polarization, that's problematic, right? Quality information has to matter. We have to deal with this polarization, and we have to deal with, we have systems, again, political systems, media systems, and tech platforms that we've incentivized polarization for. That's the financial model. How do you survive now as a news source, now that it's all narrowcasting versus broadcasting, and all the advertisement has gone to Google, and is to pick your audience and tell them what they want to hear, right? So we do a lot with local news. Like, how do we reimagine local journalism? As the model's not working now, and it's contributing to the problem. I got 3 minutes, and I got to run to the airport.
I got one more question online. If you're talking to someone with a strong opinion and you are willing to take in their perspective, but they do not reciprocate, it seems that you weaken your position.
Yeah.
Can you speak to
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was saying about the individual skills versus the community skills, right? If you get really good at doing this one-on-one, but the overall environment still rewards polarization, then yeah, you're kind of at a disadvantage in a sense, right? So yes, those individual skills are necessary, but we also have to work to kind of change the systems and change the incentive process. But I will say, part of the catty corner thinker, right? Like one of the best solutions, like when you're having a real big argument with someone, is to try to find something that you agree with or something, they say something like, I disagree with most of what you say, but one thing I think you got that you're making me think is this, right? And yes, they might take advantage of that, and, oh well. But often what actually happens, another basic human nature positive thing is this notion of reciprocity, right? And what often happens is they go, yeah, and you know what? I disagree with what you say, but and all of a sudden you've opened up this thing, right? Because that's what we're trying to get away from that catty corner and just try to realize, yeah, you should be on a side because you think the upside outweighs the downside, right? That doesn't mean you have to deny any downside, right? And it doesn't mean you have to deny any upside, right? So you more kind of, and the best thing of it, and this is what polarity management does, how far back that thing is, but really quick point I want to make. Yeah, it's pretty far back. Oh, there we go. The nice thing is when you actually have a really good conversation with someone and you fill in your blanks, right? And you recognize your downside, some of the stuff that they're concerned about, you're like, oh yeah, that's reasonable, right? And some of the things that they care about, you're like, ooh, that's pretty important. I haven't thought of it that way, right? Now you start filling this out. Often you realize y'all agree on the downsides and the upside. And instead of the whole tension being left versus right of who's right and who's wrong, it's like, hey, why don't we work together to make sure we stay on the top and avoid the bottom? Right? So that's that shift from an adversarial mindset to a collaborative mindset. And polarity management, again, there'll be a video of me kind of walking through that's what it's all about. When you look at the tension, and you lean into the tension, you start, you get away from this, you have to win. And you're like, how do we work together to actually move the needle on the issues we care about? And you actually find out you agree on a lot more than you think, right? There's one more hand on the very back.
Yeah, this may be a very tangential conversation, but I'm just curious about like when you talk about building these community systems, like what those examples look like. Like, are you working with like local schools? Are you working with educational systems? Like,
yeah, you allow me to go back to the slide I skipped, right? So the fourth stage in the building thing is to reinvigorate and create new bridging institutions. And I talked about PEFC and water literate leaders. So there's organizations that divide us and organizations that kind of bring us together. We've lost, this is the kind of the theory of bowling alone. We've lost all these groups that brought us together kind of across perspectives. So how do we rebuild those or create new ones? I work with local newsrooms, with libraries, with universities, with community foundations, with all, with civic groups, like Lions clubs and Rotary clubs and so forth. Like how do we create these groups come together? We're seeing now, one of my former students helped start the interfaith kind of organization at CSU. She's been really involved in the community interfaith. So you're having these intentional bridging organizations. Bridge USA, Braver Angels are about bringing reds and blues together. Interfaith, we do a lot of intergenerational. So how do we do more of these things that are bringing people together across perspectives in productive ways? So that's what we're doing at the local level. And those are all kind of helping each other out. So organization called Better Together America is trying to do that, kind of launch these in different communities, and has like a blueprint and kind of training that I'm involved in. And that's where Braver Angels is kind of shifting from being just a dialogue across red and blue to more like how do we kind of equip people to do things together. So that's part of it. Just having a conversation with someone on the other side can help kind of dispel polarities and so forth. Actually working with someone across the side on a common problem, that's what actually makes it stick, right? That's when we realize, oh, wait a second. So that's what we're trying to do is local communities actually doing stuff, find an issue, maybe not the hottest issue, right? Maybe not the most controversial cultural war issue. Hey, let's find an issue we both care about and learn how to work together. And all of a sudden we start realizing like, wait, these caricatures that people are telling me about the people on the other side is not true. So thanks for your attention. We'll give you some more information. If there's some questions that I'm going to put online, I'll try to dig into those as well and dig into that resource page. The resource page has I guess I'll just give you a link. If you didn't catch it yet. If you want to capture that, that's the Google Doc. They'll have links to everything. If you're on LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I'm the only Martín Carcasson in the world, so it's not hard to find me.